Hello, I'm Mike Hoag of Lily House Permaculture, and in this video we're going to be discussing the basics of polyculture design, giving you a quick overview of the rest of this video series, and starting to discuss the principles of polyculture design. Now, you probably wouldn't be here if you didn't already have some idea of what polyculture was, but I'm going to start by defining polyculture anyway. Think first about those monocultures, mono meaning one, a planting of just one crop altogether, such as those cornfields we discussed in the first video. Polyculture is the opposite of that, poly meaning many. It's many plants planted in all together into one field, into one garden. Now, there are many types of polycultures. In fact, the common American home garden, which integrates many different kinds of vegetables, is actually a form of polyculture already. However, most people only plant one plant per bed, or one type of plant per bed, or one type of plant per row, and they're missing out on the opportunities to maximize the cooperation between plants and really take advantage of the ecological resiliency principle that biodiversity is going to help us keep our plants free from pests and weed pressures. To really take advantage of that, what we need are integrated polycultures, which maximize the contact between the plants and the types of plants in one space. For example, we might plant our tomatoes in alongside basil and carrots, because then we're getting 3 yields out of the same space, and the carrots and basil actually help keep the tomatoes healthy. Again, there are different kinds of polycultures. The one we just talked about was an annual polyculture, integrating in 3 different types of annual crop plants. Annuals being plants that grow in one season and die after harvest. We can also design perennial polycultures, perennials being plants that will last many years. For example, we could plant Jerusalem artichokes, a great tuber vegetable like a potato, in with Apios americana, a nitrogen-fixing groundnut plant that's another edible tuber that produces a vine that naturally lives with Jerusalem artichokes. 2 great vegetables in one space, both of them perennial. A mixed polyculture will use both annuals and perennials together, giving us many seasons of harvest, but also providing us space for our favorite annual vegetables. And if we add in a few woody perennials, such as elderberries and hazelnuts, in with our Jerusalem artichokes and groundnut, we have a woody perennial polyculture system. And that's the kind of system that food forests are made of. So that gives us 4 types of polycultures: annual polycultures, perennial polycultures, woody perennial polycultures, and mixed polycultures. So is this whole polyculture thing really for me? I hear a lot of people who have concerns about polycultures a lot. For example, I recently met someone who said, well, when they're out there harvesting peppers, they can go right down their monoculture row and just pick and pick and pick and pick and pick and go right through and get all of their peppers just like that. They were concerned that if they had planted a polyculture, that would be impossible for them to do. They want to do polyculture for all of the benefits of increased yields and less pest problems and all that. They just didn't think they could do it and still be able to harvest their peppers so quickly. The thing is, that's really not a barrier. You can design a polyculture to meet those needs if you do it the right way. There's no reason she couldn't design a great polyculture that still kept all of the peppers right within picking distance and all in together, so that she could still go through her garden, pick out all the peppers, but also have the protection of polyculture. And the same is true with most of the concerns I hear about polycultures. Good design can accommodate almost any of our concerns and goals. So let's go through a list of the pros and the cons of monocultures and polycultures. The pros of monocultures is that you do have all one plant in all one place. You know exactly its needs and you know how to get it to them. The only way to do that is typically with chemicals, though. For example, you know what that plant needs for fertilizer, you know what that plant needs for pesticide and herbicide, and you can get there and you can spray it all at once, and when it's time to harvest, you can come back and mechanically harvest with one harvester a whole field all at once. The disadvantages are pretty much all the same. When you harvest that field, you are stripping it of all of the nutrients that that one plant needed. You're stripping it of any habitat that would have been left for the beneficial insects and plants that would have helped us maintain the fertility and biodiversity and health of that field. And a final con of monoculture is that a cornfield looks nothing like a natural environment. It's actually kind of a strange place to see. We may romanticize it, but through most of the year, a cornfield is actually pretty ugly to look at and live around, especially when you know it's all drenched with toxic chemicals. Now let's discuss the advantages of polyculture. The first one being resistance to pests and disease pressures. Think again about that monoculture of corn. When a disease organism or a pest shows up, it has all the food it needs and knows right where to find it. But when a corn earworm enters into a polyculture like this, it enters a dangerous land of narrow, crooked paths, with predators lurking behind each leaf, unable to find the corn that it's looking for amidst all of these other plants and competitors. And the same thing is true with weeds. With a polyculture, we can fill up all of the niches that weeds would normally invade, so we lower our weeding work. Greater overall yield. In a cornfield with just corn, you probably will have a higher yield of corn than you'd ever have with a polyculture. But with a polyculture, you have the opportunity for what we call over-yielding, getting multiple harvests out of the same field, and when designed correctly, that over-yield, though tough to measure, can be far higher than the monoculture yield of just one plant, especially when measured over a long period of time, and especially when measured versus the inputs that we have to do to get that yield back. In other words, polyculture systems tend to be higher return on investment. Polycultures don't drain the soil. We have the opportunity to actually increase soil fertility by including things like nitrogen fixers and dynamic accumulators, two kinds of plants that actually fertilize the soil for us that we'll be discussing later. And finally, they're just plain more beautiful. We have the opportunity to grow flowering plants and beautiful plants and increase the wildlife habitat in our food gardens and create an environment that looks much more natural, much more regenerative and healing for us. This is a way better kind of garden to have around the home, frankly. Especially, again, when you consider that it doesn't have to be sprayed with a bunch of toxic chemicals. And a final benefit is insurance against crop failures. When you're growing this many plants, if you have a bad year for one thing, you're still going to have plenty that thrives. So again, the pros of polyculture: they reduce pest, disease, and weed pressure, increase overall yields, add to your resiliency, they're better for home gardens, and they have more potential for community beauty. The cons of polyculture, on the other hand, are, first of all, they may be less good for commercial applications. There's some people who are really smart who are working on how to crack that nut, but when it comes down to it, for the large scale, it's really easy to just get on a mechanical harvester and harvest a whole field of corn. It's a little more difficult to plan and design a polyculture on that kind of scale. And speaking of scale, another drawback is that if you have a labor force and you have a polyculture, your labor force has to be better educated. They have to be able to identify the plants, know which ones are your weeds, which ones aren't weeds, and be able to find what they're trying to harvest. So you need a smarter, better educated workforce. And you yourself have to know your plants better. You have to know your plants enough to design them so that they don't compete with each other and instead cooperate better with each other. And you have to be able to find what you're looking for when you go out to harvest. And another thing is, with that issue of harvest ease, like we talked about with the peppers, in the end, you can design around that and be able to harvest your peppers, but you have to design to do it. That takes more work when you're starting up than just planting a row of peppers. The way to say all of these cons together is simply that polyculture is a more advanced technique. You have to practice more, you have to know more, and you have to take more time to design. The way to overcome that is to simply become a more advanced gardener. Start simple, do easy things, and work up to these ideas of polyculture. There's no reason why a beginning gardener can't start learning about polyculture and putting the advantages of natural plantings to work for them. Which is why, in this series of videos, we're going to start with a bunch of easy and simple practical polyculture examples, and then we'll get to the more complex ones too. Let's discuss the series of principles that we're going to be talking about through the rest of these videos. These are the principles that we're actually going to organize this whole set of videos around. Yes, I see. Principle 1, observation. Principle 2, maximize cooperation, minimize competition. Now, this all sounds pretty duh, right? You want to minimize the competition between your plants and maximize the cooperation? Yeah. I mean, who wouldn't do that except a bunch of dummies, right? Well, when you think about it, that's exactly the opposite of what we've been doing for 10,000 years with agriculture. When we plant a monoculture of corn, for example, we're planting high densities of plants with exactly the same vulnerabilities to pests and diseases and exactly the same nutritional demands, meaning we have maximized the competition. Meanwhile, with only one plant, we've minimized the opportunity for cooperation between a network of species that could actually help us grow the corn. So in these videos, we're going to talk about strategies we can use explicitly to maximize the cooperation and minimize competition. Principle 3, high diversity. Diversity is one of the keys to successful polycultures, especially when you're beginning. If you start with enough diversity, your polycultures may simplify and you may lose some species, but you're going to maximize the opportunity for some of them to be successful and maximize the opportunity for cooperation. Principle 4, ecological modeling. The best way to design polycultures is by copying what nature does. Nature designed some pretty awesome polycultures. We can put them to work for us. For example, we're going to show you how we went out and we copied one of our favorite foraging places, a naturally occurring hedgerow along a bike trail that was just filled with food all throughout the season. And yet, no one ever had to do anything to maintain that, so we copied it and we brought it right home and we have our own ecologically modeled hedgerow. Principle 4, guild. Guilds are plant communities that are actually designed to cooperate to the max. We design the plant community to function almost like an ecosystem does, with plants to do all of the work. Plants that fertilize, plants that bring in beneficial insects, plants that mulch and keep weeds down, plants that keep the pests away. We'll learn about guild roles, the kind of roles that each plant can play to design a fully functioning guild, like the apricot pear guild you see here. Principle the next, layers. All of the polycultures that you're going to see in these videos are going to include lots of different layers. We're not going to have a specific video about it, but keep that in mind as you see all of these polycultures. Principle 6. Principle 6, building blocks. All of the different kinds of polycultures that we're going to talk about in these videos can be used as building blocks to create a forest garden. We'll show you how we've used exactly that strategy to assemble a complete forest garden, one guild, one polyculture at a time, stacking them together, getting each one right to weave together a beautiful tapestry of polycultures. Alright, so now you have an idea of what's going to be covered in this class, and you have a good framework for starting to understand polycultures. Let's get started!